Tonight's lecture concerns itself with the Jewish people, being a minority in the culture of the modern world, in the culture of modernity. Again, without being too crass, there's a 4-tape lecture series that's available through Destiny, which discusses the Orthodox response to modernity as seen through Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch and Rabbi Azriel Hildesheimer and Rabbi Saul Salanter and Rav Kook. But tonight's lecture differs from that because tonight we're talking about the Jewish people as a whole, and it's trying to come to terms, struggle to come to terms with the modern world, with modernity. Now, modernity includes many different areas. First one is technology. The modern world is a technological wonder. It has in itself many, many features that even 50 years ago were undreamt of, certainly 100 years ago. Certainly in the time of the Middle Ages, no one imagined a world such as the one that we live in. But technology brings with it benefits and problems, like everything else in life. Almost nothing is one-sided, being perfectly good or being perfectly problematic. And therefore, it brought problems to the Jewish world as well. And I'll give you a few examples. What technology does, basically, is it puts people out of work because of the fact that the old jobs are gone. So a certain level of the population never gets retrained, is never able to accommodate itself to the new world, and becomes either the burden of the rest of the population, or it is completely ignored and devastated. Now, you'll say, as we all do, well, progress is progress, and that overall the economies are improved. We see in the modern world there certainly there's a greater deal of affluence, there's a greater deal of comfort, of leisure, than there was in the world before. Every year there are more and more people who could be considered wealthy people, etc. And therefore, on the whole, it is a benefit. But as people know, a minor surgery is what you have to undergo, but major surgery is what I have to undergo. And so it applies to this idea as well. It's great for the economy, it's great for people generally, but the poor guy that lost a job, it's not so great for him. So I'll give you an example, one of the examples of technology as it came into the Jewish world. And that example, and the one that I always use, is the one of the matzah baking machine. In 1858 in Austria, someone invented, for whatever reason, a machine that bakes matzahs. Now, the 1858 version is certainly crude and primitive in comparison to the matzah baking machines which exist in the Jewish world today. But it nevertheless was a matzah baking machine. And because of the fact that it was a matzah baking machine, it dispossessed people, because until then everybody had hand-baked matzahs. So the question arose, were the Jews to use, what was the opinion regarding machine matzahs baked by the machine and not by hand? And there was a great division of opinion amongst the rabbis. Many great rabbonim said it was mutter, it was completely permissible. Not only permissible, they said it would, the matzahs would be more kosher. There'd be less problems with the matzahs, because the truth of the matter is that the greatest problem of chametz on Pesach is with the matzahs. It's not with the chocolate bar. And the hand-baked matzahs require a great skill not to become chametz. And sometimes they're folded over, and there are all sorts of questions regarding hand-baked matzahs. And here you have a matzah, that's problem without problems. And not only that, things that are done by hand, so people become tired. So if you get the matzah that's baked 7 in the morning, then you're all right. But if you get the matzah that's baked 4:30 in the afternoon, when people have been standing on their feet for 7, 8, 9 hours already and have been rolling the dough, etc., so then you cannot expect the same quality. And therefore they said that these matzahs were permissible. There are all sorts of questions in halakha, whether lishmo, everything, but those that said it was permissible took care of all of the problems. Those that said it was not permissible, and they were also a formidable group of rabbis, had many reasons why. But one of the reasons that they mentioned, and that's interesting, one of the reasons they mentioned is that it puts people out of work, especially poor people. In Europe, it was traditional that women that were without means of support the rest of the year would work in the matzah factories producing matzah, and that income that they had for the month or for 6 weeks many times lasted them for the entire year. And now you're dispossessing those people. They're not going to have a job. And therefore, there was rabbinic opinion that the matzahs are kosher, but we shouldn't do it because of the fact that it dispossesses people. Now we all know today that the matzah baking machines have been improved enormously, and that that machine matzahs are used throughout the Jewish world, etc., even though people still use hand matzahs as well. But nevertheless, that argument against technology, so to speak, was pushed aside. And that argument is not raised again. And in the great labor union debates which took place at the beginning of the 20th century in Jewish Poland, when the Jewish labor unions organized, especially in the textile business, in Lodz and in other places, so they had strong rabbinic support. And then there was a question, how could you fire people? Because as the machinery improved, you needed less and less people. And whether or not you could just discharge people. Well, we are now in the modern world where people are discharged, they tell you Friday not to come in Monday. And that's the world economy today operates on that basis, and enormous amounts of people are put out of work, so to speak, for the general good being that of the company or the stockholders or the economy or whatever is held up to be the general good. So technology, therefore, began in the Jewish world, and I think this is important. It began in the Jewish world on the left foot. It was introduced as being something that's dangerous. Dangerous simply because of the fact that it harms people. People are dispossessed. And since in the Jewish world, until our time at least, in the Jewish world, most people were poor, and most people belonged to the laboring class, to the lower classes. It was a very, very narrow thread of society that could be called the upper class, and there was not much of a middle class either. Everybody was almost everybody was in the lower class, so everybody felt threatened by technology. And therefore, there was a bias against technology. A bias which still remains in certain circles in the Jewish world today, but today there are other reasons for it. The technology also produces, especially in terms of media and communication, produces the ability to do great harm. I mean, if the Second World War would have been fought on CNN, neither Hitler nor Japan would have been defeated, simply because the media creation of it would not have allowed it. And in our time, this revolution in communication also brought questions in the Jewish world. It began in the Jewish world with the printing press, whether or not Jews should use the printing press, because the printing press was the great tool for knowledge, but the printing press spread pornography all over Europe in a very short period of time. And because of that, there were those that opposed the printing press. Nevertheless, the printing press turned out to be the greatest boon to Torah study. We cannot imagine what the Jewish world would have looked like had it not been for the printing press. In our time, the idea of newspapers, for instance. Now, newspapers, the best of newspapers, violates certain basic Jewish values. If it's not Lashon Hara per se, it's Avak Lashon Hara, it's the dust of Lashon Hara. Right? And that goes, that crosses almost all lines. And especially in a politicized Jewish world, and in a Jewish world that is divided within itself with warring factions, so newspapers become a weapon. And the first people to use newspapers were the Haskalah, the people that were opposed to the traditional ways of the Jewish people. And they were the ones that exploited it. And then the Jewish world, the Orthodox Jewish world, produced as a defense its own newspapers and its own magazines, etc. So, for instance, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, whom I will speak about in this lecture as well, founded a journal, a newspaper, because he felt that we had to defend Jewish ideas and Jewish values. And then there were rabbinic newspapers that were published. But none of them achieved the popularity of the non-religious or anti-religious newspapers until the Chassidim in Warsaw, after the First World War, created a newspaper called the Tog, the Day, and that had a mass circulation of hundreds of thousands. And that was backed mainly by Ger Chassidim of Ger, and it was used to combat the influence of the other Jewish newspapers, the Marxist papers and the other ones. And in fact, the Ger Rebbe, before Tkiyas on Rosh Hashanah, before the shofar was sounded, and he had, in Ger, he had 40,000, 50,000 Chassidim that came, the Ger Rebbe boasted that he had 25,000 Chassidim that ate on Yom Kippur. By that he meant he had 25,000 children that came. I saw a noted professor here in Israel quoted that as showing that Ger Chassidim weren't religious in Poland. But when you don't get it, you don't get it. But so in front of this enormous crowd, and everybody wants to hear what the Rebbe says before Tkiyas, the holiest moment of the year, he said, buy their Tog, buy the newspaper every day, bring it into your house. That's the only newspaper to have. That's how you'll save your family. So, Winston Churchill said about Russia that it was dragged screaming and kicking into the 20th century. A little of that can be said about the Jewish world as well. And so then there became a question of all the other things that technology brought. So technology brought many great halachic questions. There's no question that our Shabbos is different because of technology. More comfortable, easier to observe. But all of these questions in medical ethics, in medicine, the technology of medicine today, it is as though we live in a different planet than the one that we did hundreds of years ago. And therefore, the questions of how to decide these matters, the questions that face the rabbis, are far more complicated, far more difficult, and there really are not that many guidelines, because you're talking, as I said, in a different world. And then if you look up the tshuvas that existed in the Middle Ages, it's very hard to relate them many times to the types of problems that face us today. People on resuscitators, on respirators, organ transplants, living wills. Like if you would wake somebody up from 100 years ago and tell them these are the problems that we face, it's like unbelievable. And therefore technology has spawned the great challenge. The presence of the technology itself is a great challenge to the eternity of Torah, because what does Torah have to say about it? What does Torah say about a respirator? What does it say about the ability to put one person's heart into another person's body? And that's without getting into cloning and all the other goodies that await us yet. So it's an enormous challenge, the technology of modernity. And that challenge brings with it different reactions. Well, we have, for instance, radio. So radio is the ability to reach millions of people. But radio has on it, again, like everything else, radio has on it things that should not be heard. Should you have a radio in your house? Should we employ radio? How can you be without radio, especially if you live in Israel? And then you come to the question of television, which itself is a neutral technology. And television, if it would have been properly used and employed, could have become the greatest educational tool in the history of mankind. But what happened was that it was commercialized immediately, and when it was commercialized, so then it was reduced to the lowest common denominator. It was reduced to marketing things that are basically forbidden. And people get a vicarious pleasure because you can see it without having to actually participate. And therefore the question is, what do you do with television? And I'll talk about that also, about what the reaction is. But the challenge is there. Movies, videos, the computer, the internet. These are all challenges to the Jewish way of life. There are opportunities. Great things could be done with them. But on the other hand, great harm can be wrought, as we see that in many instances it is. And therefore, the first thing that modernity did was absolutely frighten the Jewish world, because of the problems that are brought with it. What the Christian world could not do, what the Muslim world could not do, what the pagan world could not do, what the Romans, the Greeks, what no one could do, television can do. The movies can do it. The media, the internet, the world that we live in can do it very easily. and that it's a completely different challenge. And that's a challenge that does not just melt away. Second thing that modernity brought that really was revolutionary to the Jewish world. You see, until now you're talking about competing religions. So the Jew could say, listen, I believe in what I believe, and you can believe what you believe, and leave me alone. I don't believe in the Trinity. I don't believe in the virgin birth. I don't believe in it. Fine. I don't believe that Muhammad was a prophet. Because it's a question of beliefs. Modernity is not a question of beliefs. Modernity is a question of the reality of the society that you're living in. You can't say, I don't believe in television. You can say, I won't have a television in my house, or I will have one in my house. That's my choice. You can say, I'll watch this and not watch that. But you cannot say, I don't believe in the technology. Because the technology is here. And that challenge is a far different challenge than the challenge of religions. What happened also is that modernity created its own religions, aside from the technological and other advances that it brought. It created its own religions. And by that I mean that the modern world was built, and still is, it's built basically on the rejection of religion. That's not to say that most people are not religious, but the influence of religion, the influence of church, not only is minimized, but it is seen to be negative. The greatest democracy in the world, the United States, is built upon the strict separation of church and state. The separation of church and state means that religion does not play any official role in the life of the country. And that is a departure, because until the 18th century, religion was the state and the state was religion. And now religion was, so to speak, thrown out of the equation. Because of that, the French Revolution, which was basically not only an anti-aristocratic revolution, but a revolution against the church that has divided France until today, they brought all of this into focus and created an anti-religious mood, anti-religious aura to the society of the modern world, in which religion itself was held to be first irrelevant, and then it was held to be an evil. And Marx is the one that took it to the ultimate when he said that religion is the opiate of the masses, meaning as long as religion exists in the world, there really can be no progress towards the great utopian world. There really cannot be any progress towards freeing the workers, etc., because religion is, by definition, an evil. And his saying that, he meant that as long as people believed, they're not going to revolt. People believe that God destined them to be poor, as Calvin said, so then they're destined to be poor, so why should they mount a revolution against the bosses? And religion, as it existed throughout Europe and throughout the world, made people patient. It gave the ability to suffer enormous blows and tragedies and not do anything about it. And the modern world, the idea of the modern world was to reject that. It was to say that you don't have to accept these blows, you don't have to accept these tragedies, we can solve our problems, we can make the world better, and that religion, so to speak, holds us back. And that is a challenge. because religion does engender a certain fatalism within people. In Yiddish we say sebashert. So once everything is bashert, so then there's no reason to do anything. Because whatever I do is not going to change what is bashert. Chassidim tell the story that the Baal Shem Tov once went to raise funds or something for a certain cause, and he came into town and he knocked on the window of the first house, and then he left. So the Chassidim said, "What?" So he said, "Well, I did mine, right? And the rest is bashert, how much I'm going to get. I just have to try." So where the line is of trying, how much trying, will you ever have more, right? If you work 12 hours a day instead of 8 hours a day, will you really have more? These are questions that gnaw at people. And the modern world rejected. The modern world said, certainly if you work 12 hours, you'll have more than 8 hours. And that, so to speak, the whole idea of things being bashert, fate, fatalism, all of that had to be discarded. And what happened is that this created modernity as a religion itself, as a faith. Atheism is as much a faith as belief in any of the major religions. An atheist is a true believer, except he believes in his own belief. And the modern world, which gave rise to utopian ideas one after another that all proved so disastrous for mankind. Look at the utopian ideas of the last 150 years of anarchy, of Marxism, all the divisions of Marxism, of fascism, of Nazism, of all of the things that have beset us, that have cost literally 150 million lives, if not more. The entire population of the world at the time of the Roman Empire has been destroyed in the last century in the pursuit of utopian ideas, in the pursuit of the better world, in the pursuit that somehow not only do we have the ability, but we have the imperative to make the world better, and we're going to tinker with it until it happens. And that if you want to have an omelet, then you have to break eggs. If you want to have the better world, then those who stand in the way, you've got to get rid of them. And that has been part of the idea that modernism brought to the world, modernity brought to the world. Take a look at the idea of psychology and psychiatry, which in the modern world, I mean, if you don't have your own therapist, then something's wrong with you. So everybody has one. But most of the time, it's a difficult generality, but so I don't have any statistics. I can only say it from my own personal observations. Most of the people engaged in the field will tell the person that being religious is a problem. It inhibits, etc. And therefore, for instance, if I ever had to refer someone to a mental health professional, I always referred to a person that was a religious person, which is not necessarily true if I referred someone to a medical doctor or to a lawyer or to any other professional. But when it came to psychology, to psychiatry, if you referred to a person that was not religious, so then 9 times out of 10, the first advice was that, well, you have to give up. You have to give up your observance, your ritual, and that would be on the way to cure you. And therefore, what happened again, at least in the traditional Jewish world, is that people shied away from those things. Not only shied away from mental health professionals, but it became a matter of shame. And it's taken us a long time, many, many decades, and we're not out of it yet, to somehow create within our society the idea that many times it's necessary, it's positive, it's something that should be done, and that, so to speak, the science of psychological advice is not necessarily adverse to Torah. But in the modern world, it started with Freud, but it was developed. Freud is pretty much discredited today among psychiatrists. There are very few Freudian psychiatrists left. But the inclination to be opposed to religion, there certainly exists today. Then you had the destruction of many ideas that were basically religious by the science that was introduced in the modern world. Such questions as the age of the world, the age of the universe. So what do you do with people? All the basic books today say that the world is hundreds of millions of years old. All right, and if you say it's 5,762 years old, so then you immediately run to a great challenge. What is it, 5,762 years old or hundreds of millions of years old? And if it is hundreds of millions of years old and you only felt it was 5,762 years old, then your whole faith is destroyed. You're not arguing about the age of the world, you're arguing about a pillar of faith. Now whether 5,762 years is a pillar of faith, so sophisticated Jews, great rabbis have discussed the matter back and forth. There are all sorts of opinions. There are all sorts of ways to reconcile the fact that the world can be hundreds of millions of years old. There are books written on it by noted astrophysicists, many of whom are Orthodox, observant Jews. But that's all on a sophisticated level. But when you're in 6th grade or 7th grade or 8th grade, and the science book says that it's hundreds of millions of years old, what do you do then? That's the challenge. There was something not long ago here in Israel, 2 or 3 years ago. Pepsi-Cola obtained the certification of the Badats, of the Eidah Haredis. And it's a war with Coca-Cola, who only has Rav Lando from Bnei Brak. So Pepsi is, not only is it more carbonated, but it's holier. So an ad agency sold Pepsi a great idea, as only ad agencies do. And they had a campaign to market Pepsi somehow with dinosaurs appearing on the label of Pepsi. So the Badats withdrew the Hechsher. They withdrew the certification because they said there are no dinosaurs. And the only way to phrase what really happened is that the Badats made the dinosaurs extinct. Because Pepsi, they had to pull the ad campaign. Now, were there dinosaurs? Well, all the paleontologists will swear by it, the anthropologists, you see their skeletons all over the place, and they found fossil bones and all sorts of things. Certainly there were dinosaurs. And if there were dinosaurs, so what is that? What does that prove? But again, if you take a stand that there never were dinosaurs, and that becomes a principle of your faith, and science says that there were dinosaurs, let alone Steven Spielberg, but science says that there were dinosaurs, so then that's a challenge. Well, I remember from my years in the yeshiva in Muncie that all of these questions were real questions, and that was to 9th and 10th and 11th grade young men who I felt were already sophisticated and who had gone through day school and who were raised in religious homes and who existed in a religious society, and they were badly shaken by it. Because somehow it became a principle of faith that there were no dinosaurs, or it can't be hundreds of millions of years old. And this challenge remains today. How do we deal with scientific matters? How do we deal with things that are proven? As late as 12 years ago, or 14 years ago, there was a book published here in Hebrew in which a yeshiva student attempted to prove that the earth is flat. Talmudically, he's going to prove that the earth is flat. Because to him, the earth being flat is a basic pillar of Judaism, and if the earth is not flat, then there it goes. And that is the danger that modernity posed, because of the fact that a lot of the bathwater, so to speak, of Judaism became equated with the baby, and science, to a great extent, has destroyed much of the bathwater. In a scientific world, in a world of realism, then a lot of things became superstition. A lot of things really have no place with us. A lot of things, and you know that people love these things more. It's easier to get people to put a red string around their wrist than it is to have them put on film. Because people believe that a red string is going to save you. And film they're not so certain about. But nowhere in the Torah does it say anything about red strings. But it does say about film. And part of the what happened to the Jewish people over the thousands of years of exile is that in our suitcases we took a lot of baggage with us, and some of it doesn't belong to us. It's not ours. When you stand at the luggage rack at Ben Gurion and every bag looks the same and everybody's pulling bags off, you can end up with the wrong bag too. A lot of the things that we have are the wrong bag. That's not us. But it has somehow become equated with being us. I tell the story about a dear relative of ours, of my wife's, that I never tell stories about my relatives, that a child in their family was becoming bar mitzvah. So he came over the month before the bar mitzvah. He came over to our house to visit, and we gave him a present and everything. And so he tells me in great pride that beginning tomorrow he's putting on film, and from now on he's only going to wear white shirts. So putting on film and wearing white shirts are equal. They're one and the same in his mind. But they're not one and the same. There can come a day where, God forbid, he'll have to wear a blue shirt. Then what will he say? And that is what happened to the Jewish people in the 19th and 20th centuries to a great extent. That because of the side issues, so to speak, because of the baggage that we picked up was somehow destroyed by the modern world, so then everything was destroyed. The lack of sophistication. The Rambam in his letters always says, I'm writing a letter to you, he says, because you're sophisticated, you want to know the truth, I can explain it. He said, but for the Hamon, for the masses, he says, they like, and he says it, they like to hear the drushes and the stories Shabbos afternoon, and that's it. And I can't deal with that. So modernity really provided that enormous challenge, and it still does today. And now that we know about DNA, and we know about cloning, and we know about cells, and we're unraveling the secrets that make us tick. So then there also, how do you look at people? How do we deal with it? How do we understand it? So those are enormous challenges to our faith. But they're very rarely dealt with because of the enormity of the change in the world. The Rambam says an example. The Rambam lives in the 12th century, in the 13th, by the beginning of the 13th century. The Rambam is the most advanced man of his age. The Rambam is the greatest man maybe since Rashi, certainly in the Jewish world. There was nobody like him. The Rambam gives as an example an impossibility, something that cannot be. The Rambam says, Sfinas barzel haporeach ba'avir, a metal boat that flies. The Rambam says that's impossible. But it's not impossible. It's $1,200 round trip. If we are on a Sfinas barzel haporeach ba'avir, we are in a metal boat that flies in the air. So what if science and technology are able to do things that previously we held were to be impossible? What does that do to our faith? So is the Rambam any less believable because he used that example? So to me, he's not. To me, if the Rambam was here, he would say, well, we have to pick another example because that one obviously is wrong. He wouldn't be nervous of it. But I can think of plenty of people who are nervous because of it. I remember teaching that Rambam, and it shook a lot of people because it shook their faith in the Rambam, so to speak. The Talmud speaks of spontaneous generation, that there are certain creatures that somehow come into existence by themselves. Well, science has proven that there is no such thing. Does that lessen the Talmud? Not to me. The Talmud has all sorts of medicines, how to cure things. Well, today, those medicines don't work. So you'll see that all the Achronim, all the commentators say one should never use the medicines of the Talmud. Why? If the Talmud is never wrong. The answer is that the Talmud, when it discusses halacha and Torah, is never wrong. When it discusses medicine, it's talking about the medicine of its time. But that already requires a sophistication to be able to say that. It requires an ability to somehow differentiate. And there are many in the Jewish world who are not willing to do it. And there are many in the Jewish world who therefore say, I had a discussion with a professor here not long ago, and he brought up that quote of the Rambam to me, and he said, you see, the Rambam is wrong, so then why should I accept the Rambam on anything else? So I said to him, in your entire career, you never found that any academic was wrong on one thing, but he could be right on many other things? Why do you require perfection from us? We have to be right on everything. If we're 99% right and 1% wrong, then everything is wrong. But that's a specious argument to a certain extent because we say we are 100% right. We don't want to admit that we're 1% wrong also. And because that becomes a defense to modernity, so then we open the door to this type of criticism and to the problems that it occasions. Modernity also brought with it a completely different set of values in society. Modernity is built upon youth and not upon people who are older. The Jewish world was built upon respect for elders. Chazal said, "Im chochma ein kan, zikna yesh kan." If there's no wisdom, at least there's age here. He's entitled because of age. In today's world, age is a diminishing value. And certainly all the heroes that are presented in the world today are people who are young, right? Sports figures, media figures, stars, actors, actresses, politicians, right? Nobody wants an old politician except us. We're the only country in the world that, unless you're 70, you can't even start to think about being something. But otherwise, the rest of the world, it doesn't go. And you have to be photogenic, and you have to somehow have the ability to communicate. All things, Abraham Lincoln could never be elected president of the United States today. Never. Had a high, squeaky voice. He was ugly. He was ungainly. He was the greatest president we had. Saved America. And today he couldn't get elected to Congress from the Southern District of Illinois anymore. The values changed. Unfettered freedom. So freedom, one of the great things that modernity brought was individual freedom. But it brought individual freedom almost without restraint. And freedom without restraint brings enormous problems. And the question of the individual versus society, where does the line drawn there? Is there any duty owed to society generally? I can do my own thing, forget it. The idea of what is moral and immoral. So modernity said there were no absolute moralities. Morality is whatever the people decide. In essence, that was the idea how Judaism was redefined. Solomon Schechter said that Judaism is whatever the Jewish people say it is. So they define it. So if Judaism is, to drive a car on Shabbos, so then that's Judaism. If Judaism is that you can eat whatever you want, so that's Judaism. If Judaism is, that you can, that one spouse need not be Jewish, that's also Judaism. It's whatever you decide. And that's really the importation of the modern value of morality into the definition of what Judaism is. And we see that from the Israeli Supreme Court over and over again. The law is whatever, whatever you want, because of the agenda that modernity sets. Wealth, the rabbis never preached poverty, but the rabbis always warned about the problems of wealth, of money. But money has become, I guess because of the fact that many more people have access to it, and many more people find it attainable, which is all to the good, but money has become the goal. It's not the it's the end itself. It's not just the means to accomplish something. And then there's no behavior that is considered deviant behavior anymore. Senator Moynihan, in one of his famous speeches in the Senate, said that we have defined deviancy downward. There is no definition of deviancy anymore. Everything goes. Not only everything goes, you're supposed to admire it. You're not supposed to speak out against it. And the question of the world to come, of an afterlife, of the soul, all of that is ignored in modernity. Modernity is now, here and now. It's not even 50 years from now, it's just now. And these values really run counter almost to every basic Jewish idea of life. So to be a modern Jew, so to speak, becomes an oxymoron. Because if it's like a democratic Jewish state. If you're going to be really democratic, you're not going to be Jewish. And if you're going to be Jewish, you're not going to meet the definition, the modern day definition of being democratic. In a democratic state, why shouldn't we allow 3 million Arabs to return, and we'll have one man, one vote, and we'll have a state? I mean, why are we so obstinate? The answer is we want a Jewish state. Well, if you want a Jewish state, then it's against democracy. Where is the line here? Now, that line never needed to be drawn until now, until the challenge of the modern world. The modern world is what forces that challenge upon us. And somehow we have to come up with answers. But the problem is never, in my opinion, has yet never been addressed directly. So on one hand, you have a reaction to the Jewish world that we adopt everything that's modern. And that being a Jew is not only secondary, being a Jew is a personal choice, and whatever you want to do. That was the choice that was made by the Marxist Jews. It was the choice that was made by many Jews. And we see it today in the assimilation in the Jewish world. It's ironic, and I don't speak for God. That's not my task. I haven't got a clue as to what he wants to do here. But one thing is clear, that this tremendous outburst of anti-Semitism all over the world is making a lot of Jews uncomfortable. A lot of Jews who were 3 years ago were very comfortable, who never gave a second thought to their Jewishness, and who now are shaken by it. Because all of a sudden they realize that somehow they mean them also. And now what do we do? What is most frightening about the modern world is that the worst anti-Semitism in the history of the human race has occurred in the modern world. If we could go back to the good old days of the Middle Ages, or the good old days of Rome, it would not equal what has happened to us in the past century, and what is happening now. So the modern world, with all of its value systems, and all of its wonderful phraseology, and its utopian promises, has been for the Jewish people an exercise in death, in enormous dangers. We have never been in such a precarious position as we are today. Not even under desire. So you have this tremendous irony that the modern world, which has given us freedom and tolerance. There was an article today in the Wall Street Journal, or yesterday, about how colleges in the United States are now determined to recruit Jewish students because I think with the articles about Vanderbilt University that wants to get into the Ivy League. You can't get in the Ivy League if you don't have a lot of Jewish students, because if you have a lot of Jewish students, all of a sudden the marks go up, and it becomes, the professors want to come, and so on one hand, right, you never had it so good. And on the other hand, the synagogue in London today was completely defaced and demolished almost. You had 300 incidents in France alone last month. We're back to the 1930s, God forbid. So this question of modernity has proven to be a very taxing one in all of its appeal, but what has it done for us? Therefore, there are many elements in the Jewish world that is just like many embrace modernity, there are many that reject it completely, right? And I'm going to have no newspapers, no radio, no television, no internet, nothing. Nothing. I'm living like the 17th century and leave me alone. And that's an understandable position. I don't know if it's a practical one. Rabbi Salanter said in the 19th century that ideas and values cannot be shut out no matter what you do. But at least I understand the mentality. We have the same mentality today. We're going to build a fence. All right? We're going to separate. I mean, who are you kidding? In a world of rockets and planes and Scuds, you're going to separate. But why do we advance that? Because if it's understandable. If you would have the experiences that we have had, if anyone would have gone through the last 19 months, certainly we're going to separate. So there are many that say we're going to separate, right? We don't want the modern world. Forget it. And then there are those, it's the same thing is true in politics as it is in the religious faith area. There are those that say, well, we're going to take the best that we can. We're going to retain our faith. We're going to be Torah Jews, but we're going to be in the modern world as well. Now that's an ever-narrowing sector, because the extremes, like the extremes in politics and the extremes in the world, are gaining and the middle ground is eroding. But that was the idea of Rabbi Hirsch, and that was the idea really of Rabbi Salanter as well, and that was the idea of Hildesheimer, and that was the idea of Rabbi Yaakov Yechiel Weinberg, and it was the idea of Rav Kook, and it was the idea of many, many other great Rabbonim, that somehow we could live in peace with the modern world, and that the modern world was going to be a benefit for us. But again, I can understand that Jews who came out of Auschwitz didn't want to have much to do with the modern world. We're very happy to put on the shtreimel again and say, go jump in the lake. The modern world has no appeal to us. You have nothing to offer us. And those are really the issues that face us today.